10 years ago, Singapore's former ambassador to the UN, Kishore Mahbubani, delivered a provocative lecture at Harvard Kennedy School. He warned that how America behaved as the world's number one power will determine how China would behave when it became number one. 10 years later, we can now look back with clarity. In this video, I make a simple claim. Mahbubani correctly identified 5 critical dynamics that have shaped the decade from 2015 to 2025. First, he foresaw that Asian universities and innovation centers would rise dramatically. Today, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Guangzhou ranks as the world's number 1 innovation cluster, ahead of Silicon Valley. Second, he anticipated China's economic resilience despite Western skepticism. Third, he predicted the success of China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank despite American opposition. Fourth, he anticipated America's continued retreat from multilateral institutions. And fifth, most importantly, he grasped the fundamental relational dynamic between the two powers. He did this not by predicting specific events, but by observing the logic of power. But he also made one critical forecasting error, not about economics or strategy, but about timing. At the end, we'll examine this single variable that changed everything. Let's review each prediction, starting with the least significant and building to the most consequential. During the Q&A session at Harvard, a student challenged Mahbubani, asking, when you look at the world's top 20 universities, not a single university is from China. Universities take 300 years to build, like Harvard. How is China planning to fill that gap? End quote. Mahbubani's response was illuminating.
Firstly, I'm very pleased to inform you that I think about 2-3 weeks ago, the New York Institute for International Education, AIIB, came out with a new book called Asia as the Next Higher Education Superpower. And the introductory essay was co-written by me and a fellow author, the provost. Please read that essay because it actually gives you a lot of data to talk about trend lines. Yes, it's true that the largest, the best universities in the world are still in America, and so it'll take some time, but the trend line is very powerful in terms of development of new universities, institutions of higher education, and so forth. But the second point, which is a very critical point that I need to make here, is that America has been remarkably generous to the world by training the elites of the world in American universities. And I always say that one reason why East Asia has defied all conventional wisdom and why East Asia remains peaceful is that the elites in East Asia, including the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, the Indonesians, the Thais, the Singaporeans, and Malaysians, have all studied in American universities. And you know what happens? They use the same concepts, they understand each other, and they can get along with each other. Now, this is a remarkable contribution that American universities have made towards peace in East Asia that no one has fully recognized.
10 years later, the trend lines Mahbubani identified have materialized dramatically. Let's start universities. In the 2025 Times Higher Education Asia University Rankings, China leads decisively, retaining first and second place and holding 5 of the top 10 spots. Tsinghua University and Peking University have held the top 2 positions for 5 consecutive years. In the global rankings, these 2 Chinese universities now occupy 12th and 13th place worldwide. But the most striking validation of Mahbubani's prediction comes from innovation cluster rankings. In September 2025, the World Intellectual Property Organization released its Global Innovation Index. The Shenzhen Hong Kong Guangzhou cluster now ranks first globally, ahead of Silicon Valley, which ranks third. This isn't just about one cluster. China has become the top patent cooperation treaty filer, representing a quarter of all PCG applications worldwide. Silicon Valley continues to lead in venture capital activity, but the concentrated density of patents, scientific publications, and venture capital activity in Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Guangzhou has created what WIPO now recognizes as the world's most productive innovation ecosystem. In 2015, the idea that the Chinese innovation cluster would even compete, let alone surpass Silicon Valley within a decade, seemed far-fetched. Yet the trend lines Mahbubani mentioned have materialized. In 2025, innovation cluster rankings identify vibrant hubs across Asia, not just in China, but in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and India. This doesn't mean American institutions have declined. Rather, it reflects a global leveling of research and innovation capacity. In 2015, American discourse was filled with predictions of China's imminent economic collapse. Mahbubani heard these concerns constantly during his visit to Harvard.
I'm really glad you raised that question because I've been here for 48 hours. And I must say, almost every person I met in Harvard, the first question they ask me when we talk about China is, can China sustain its economic growth? And of course, it's possible that there could be a massive slowdown in China. They could go to grow at 3-4% or whatever. So that's possible. But if I was a betting man, I'm prepared to take bets with you all that I think China will be able to sustain growth of 7%. Now, there's a very good reason why the Chinese have decided to slow down their economic growth, because they are now shifting from one model of economic growth to another model of economic growth. They used to rely a lot on export-led growth. They can no longer do that because they're no longer the big markets in the West that they can rely on. They're trying to switch to an internal consumption-led growth. And it takes time to do that. And if you are running a fast train around a corner, it's best to slow down and do that. And secondly, if you look at the amount of investments that China has put in, the infrastructure, the world-class infrastructure that China has built in their ports, airports, roads, rail, and so on and so forth, that kind of world-class infrastructure reaps dividends. Plus, the Chinese Communist Party is in many ways one of the most meritocratic organizations in the world, and the quality of mind of key Chinese policymakers has never been as good as it is today. Now, if you have a government staffed by remarkably good minds, taking advantage of a world-class infrastructure, I would say the possibility of maintaining good growth is there. And within Asia, by the way, China is big, but even the Chinese are 1.3 billion people, but in all of Asia, there are 3.4 billion people. That market is becoming more integrated too. So that you'll also benefit from the integration of that region. So there are many other sources of growth apart from the export-led growth that they had in the past. So if I was a betting man, I would say they can sustain the 7% growth.
10 years later, we need to look carefully at what actually happened. And here the picture is more complex than simple headlines suggest. China achieved 5% GDP growth in 2024, not the 7% Mahbubani predicted. Here is where measurement matters. If you look at nominal GDP figures, raw numbers converted to dollars, the gap between the US and Chinese economies appears to have widened dramatically since 2021. However, this widening gap is largely an artifact of two factors. US inflation has been almost 3 times higher than China's, boosting nominal US GDP growth. Meanwhile, the yuan has depreciated significantly against the dollar since 2022, making China's economy appear smaller when converted to dollars. In real terms, adjusted for inflation in each country, China's economy continues to grow faster than the United States. In purchasing power parity terms, which adjust for price differences and reflect actual productive capacity, China's economy stood at $38 trillion in 2024 compared to America's $29 trillion. The gap continues to widen. Which measure is right? That's not a neutral question. Nominal GDP matters for international financial power and military spending. PPP matters for actual economic size and living standards. Both measures are real, the choice of which to emphasize reflects your analytical priorities, not objective truth. What Mahbubani got right was the resilience. China did not collapse. His core argument that China's development model had more staying power than Western skeptics believed has been validated. In his 2015 lecture, Mahbubani highlighted a recent event he called a sign of the times. China proposed creating the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The United States opposed it. Then Britain, America's closest ally, broke ranks and joined anyway. Mahbubani saw this as evidence that countries were preparing for a world where America would no longer be number one.
The latest episode that has happened in US-China relations, and which is, of course, as you know, is the Chinese decision to set up an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which unwisely the United States decided to oppose. And as you know, and this is in many ways a sign of the times, in the past, a veto by Washington DC would have meant that all the allies would have stood firmly behind the United States, and the United States veto would have held. But even to my surprise, the first country to break that veto was the number one ally of the United States, which is the United Kingdom. And that's a sign of the times, that countries are now preparing for a world in which the United States will no longer be number one.
This prediction has been vindicated in multiple ways. The AIIB has grown from 57 founding members to 111 approved members as of December 2025. It holds $100 billion in capital and AAA ratings from all major credit agencies. Western European nations followed, then Pacific nations, African nations, and Latin American nations. The American veto, which once would have been absolute, simply failed. Today, nations from India to Indonesia, Turkey to South Africa, and Saudi Arabia to Brazil constantly balance their economic ties with China against their security alliances, predominantly with the United States. Mahbubani identified this fundamental shift in global diplomacy early. Countries worldwide are now hedging between powers. In his 2015 lecture, Mahbubani argued that America was short-sightedly undermining the very multilateral institutions and norms that would protect American interests once China became more powerful.
Because as you know, very famously, Bob Zoellick, many years ago, called on China to emerge as a responsible stakeholder of the global system. But when he made that call, I think he assumed that, of course, the United States is a responsible stakeholder of the global system. And the hard part here is to try and tell an American audience that's not how the United States is often perceived overseas. And that's why I told the three stories from the financial sector at the beginning of my lecture, because the rest of the world quite often sees the United States acting unilaterally, acting in its own interests, and often at the expense of global interests. And it's rather tragic to watch in the UN, as I did at first hand, to see that the institutions that were essentially created by the United States after World War II, these were basically American-inspired institutions which have then been undermined by American policies. And I think, in many ways, the United States has been very unwise in undermining these global institutions, because every action that the United States makes in undermining these global institutions could then be replicated by China. And that's why, in my latest book, The Great Convergence, I decided to begin the book by quoting from a very wise speech that Bill Clinton gave, am I allowed to mention Yale, in 2003. And this is what Bill Clinton said: "If you believe that maintaining power and control and absolute freedom of movement and sovereignty is important to your country's future, there's nothing inconsistent in that. The US is the biggest and most powerful country in the world now. We've got the juice and we're going to use it." But then he added a but, Bill Clinton. He said, "But if you believe we should be trying to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in when we are no longer the military, political, economic superpower in the world, then you wouldn't do that." So Bill Clinton was being very wise in saying, as long as America thinks it'll be number one, yes, we can go on undermining multilateral institutions. But if we can conceive of a world in which we are number two, then surely it is in America's interest to strengthen multilateral rules and processes. But what is strange is that Bill Clinton only gave the speech once and never repeated that again. Because I'm told it's political suicide in America to speak about America being number two.
This prediction has proven accurate. Over the past decade, America has continued and even accelerated its retreat from multilateralism. The Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, weakened the World Trade Organization, and pursued unilateral trade policies. This brings us to Mahbubani's most important insight, the one that has proven most prophetic over the past decade. At the end of his lecture, Mahbubani posed a question to his audience.
So if you want to have that world to be a peaceful and orderly one, the time has therefore come for the United States to ask a very simple question. Would the United States feel comfortable living in a world where China behaves just as America did when it was the sole superpower. Thank you.
This was his core thesis. The relationship between the world's number one power and the rising challenger isn't predetermined. How America behaves now, while it's still number one, will shape how China behaves when it becomes number one. If America undermines international law, China will learn that great powers can ignore international law. If America weaponizes the dollar, China will learn to weaponize the yuan. If America imposes extraterritorial application of its domestic laws, China will learn to do the same. If America abandons multilateral institutions when they constrain its freedom of action, China will learn that institutions are disposable. Over the past decade, this relational dynamic has unfolded exactly as Mahbubani predicted. Consider trade policy. In 2015, when Mahbubani gave his lecture, the US-China trade relationship was tense but functional. By 2025, both countries have imposed massive tariffs on each other. Consider technology policy. The United States pioneered the use of national security grounds to ban foreign technology companies and restrict semiconductor exports. China has now learned this playbook. It has developed its own restrictions on rare earths exports, imposed bans on American companies, and used national security as justification for economic warfare. Consider financial infrastructure. The United States weaponized SWIFT, dollar clearing systems, and access to American capital markets. China has responded by building alternative systems, the cross-border interbank payment system for yuan transactions, bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, and efforts to internationalize the yuan. The mechanism is this: great powers learn from each other. But we need to be precise about what Mahbubani was actually arguing. He's a seasoned diplomat who knows history. He knows that great powers, or empires as they used to be called, have historically disregarded the opinions and needs of weaker nations. Chinese dynasties were somewhat exceptional in this regard, but Mahbubani wasn't romanticizing China or predicting it would become a benevolent hegemon. His argument was more nuanced. He described a world where America will remain a superpower with enormous capabilities, but will no longer be the only one. Multiple powers of comparable strength would coexist. This is why the relational dynamic matters. With multiple great powers instead of one hegemon, the precedents set by the currently dominant power become far more consequential. This resembles Europe from the 16th to 19th centuries or the early 20th century when multiple great powers competed. Those periods ended in catastrophic wars. The question isn't whether China will be good or bad. The question is whether the transition to multipolarity will be managed through institutions and norms or through raw power. Before we end, we need to address one significant forecasting error Mahbubani made. In his 2015 lecture, Mahbubani predicted that China would overtake the United States in nominal GDP within 5 to 10 years. This hasn't happened. In nominal terms, the gap has actually widened since 2021. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't primarily a failure to understand economics. It was a failure to predict a political earthquake that would occur just 2 years after his Harvard lecture. When Mahbubani spoke in 2015, he was addressing the foreign policy establishment, people like those in his Harvard audience who had shaped US-China policy for decades. He assumed this framework would continue, manage competition, economic interdependence, diplomatic engagement, and multilateral cooperation. In 2016, Donald Trump won the presidency, making China the central organizing principle of American foreign policy. Since then, China has faced a perfect storm: a comprehensive trade war, global supply chain shocks from COVID and the Ukraine war, semiconductor blockades, and unprecedented financial warfare. That China's economy hasn't overtaken America's in nominal terms isn't evidence that Mahbubani was wrong about China's capabilities or resilience. It's evidence that he underestimated how aggressively America will deploy its full economic arsenal to prevent exactly what he predicted. On the Chinese side, Xi Jinping's increasing centralization and China's more assertive regional behavior represent a harder edge than Mahbubani might have expected, particularly in the South China Sea. But China's assertiveness has been concentrated in its immediate region. Globally, China continues working primarily through multilateral institutions: the UN, WTO, AIIB, BRICS, and other global governance bodies. It hasn't launched military interventions or imposed secondary sanctions on other countries. Its global approach remains largely institutional rather than coercive. The past decade has confirmed Mahbubani's core insight: how America behaves while it's still number one sets the pattern for how other powerful countries will behave in the future. The relational dynamic he identified is unfolding exactly as he predicted, just faster and more confrontationally than he imagined. What do you think? Was Mahbubani right? Is the world we live in today a reflection of what he predicted 10 years ago? Let me know in the comments. If you found this valuable, subscribe and click the bell to be notified when our next video comes out.